Let me first make a few comments about our panel members. We have a panel today that is extremely well qualified to speak to the topic. There are detailed bios in the material that you have in front of you, so I'll just make a few comments about each individual member of the panel and their particular area of expertise relative to trade. Starting on my right, Hollis Hart is in finance. He's been with Citibank for or Citicorp, Citigroup, whatever variation of name it had, for over 40 years. He's worked all over the world. He has responsibility today for a substantial amount of Citigroup's business around the world, and so he will bring special perspectives on the role of finance in trade. Next is our true expert on the panel. Ambassador Miriam Sapiro was most recently the Deputy USTR until a year and a half ago, I guess, a year ago, and has had a career that has involved virtually every major U.S. trade negotiation over the last 20, 25 years, both in various parts of the government, the White House, the NSC staff, the State Department, OPIC, so she brings a terrific depth of knowledge and is quite contemporaneous in what she knows about what's happening. So we look forward to that. Next on the panel is Bob Kueppers, who is leads public policy and a variety of other roles at Deloitte, including engaging with Deloitte's clients all over the world. And so he can bring perspectives on how many of the largest corporations that are served by Deloitte look at trade. And then on my far right, Jim Lawrence, who is a true international businessman. Today he is an international banker running Rothschilds in North America, but he's also a director of major international companies. He was CFO and vice chairman of General Mills. He was CFO of Unilever, which is a major company headquartered in the UK. And prior to that, he was a consultant and ran the London and Munich offices of Bain & Company. So you can see that this truly is a panel of people who are extremely well qualified to speak to the subject. Before we turn to the panel, I just wanted to make a few comments about what CED's role has been in trying to promote international trade. In 1945, here's a statement that CED issued. The United States has a major interest in the expansion of world commerce. And then it went on to talk about things that the country ought to do in that regard. Our most recent comprehensive policy statement, which was issued in 2005, talked about the significant long-term benefits of open market and outsourcing the American economy. And it talked about how trade gives our economy lower cost goods and gives our company resources to compete, and that it creates a net number of jobs for America. So there's been a very, very strong support for international trade by CED, and in its most recent policy statement in 2009, CED made the following recommendations: that the country should strive in its trade negotiations to eliminate all tariffs and non-tariff barriers, including quotas in manufactured goods, that it should eliminate all barriers to cross-border trade in services, that we should commit ourselves to reducing reliance on anti-dumping and countervailing duties and tighten procedures for remedies when those things occur. We should reaffirm the importance of enforceable commitments to the rules of the WTO and develop procedures that would reduce confrontation and increase the percentage of negotiated out-of-court arrangements on trade disputes. But in addition to promoting trade, CED has taken a strong position that public policy should result in the development and championing of adjustment programs throughout the U.S. economic sectors that are adversely affected by trade. That's easier to say than to do, but that has been a strong element of CED's recommendations, and that, I think, is an important element of the promotion of trade in the United States. So That's the backdrop in which CED approaches this subject. What I would like to do now is ask Miriam to bring us up to speed on all of the T's that we're dealing with, and then we'll turn to the other panel members and ask each one to provide kind of their perspective on the role and importance and issues associated with international trade, and then we'll open it up to other questions. We'll ask the panel, and then we'll ask you in the audience to raise your questions. So, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Pat, and thank you to Steve and your entire team for organizing this particular panel on this particular day. I don't know how you knew that it would be such a pivotal moment in U.S. trade policy. And I'll tell you why before I explain the T's. But last week, Congress introduced a Trade Promotion Authority bill. That's the first T for TPA, Trade Promotion Authority. And in record time, the Senate Finance Committee, led by Chairman Hatch and Ranking Member Wyden, took up the bill yesterday. There were some procedural wrangles, and so they couldn't take a vote on it immediately, but they stayed and eventually were able to pass that bill out of the Senate Finance Committee by 20-6. It's not going to head to the floor for a vote right away. It's going to take a little bit of time. Meanwhile, the House Ways and Means Committee is slated to take up the bill today. So again, it's really a pivotal moment, and I'm delighted to be here with everyone to talk about why that is and why this is important for American companies and American workers. So the T's. One of my colleagues joked recently, this is the Tea Party in terms of TPA, which I explained. That's the first one to think about. The second one that we'll talk about this morning is TPP, and that stands for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States is negotiating with 11 other countries, including 3 out of our 4 largest trading partners. That's good luck in many countries. You okay?
How about Washington?
It is now. So 3 out of our 4 largest trading partners, Canada, Mexico, Japan, are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It also includes some of the fastest growing economies in Asia. And together, the TPP partners are about 40% of global GDP and 1/3 of global trade. So that's an agreement we'll talk more about because it's created a bit of controversy, and it's very much tied to the question of whether Congress will give the President the authority under TPA to conclude TPP. You still with me? 2 more, 2 more T's. TTIP, not to be confused with Q-tip, which I know Johnson & Johnson, they're here, has told me. Okay, told me privately they're not crazy about the name, but it stands for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is under negotiation between the United States and Europe. These 2 economies have the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. They constitute about 50% of global GDP and about 1/3 of global trade. Taken together, if TPA is passed and both those agreements are concluded, the U.S. will then be linked to Asia and to Europe, and together the economies will represent a significant amount of global trade and, again, a significant amount of global GDP, as well as, over 1 billion consumers. Number's about 1.3 right now. The last T I'm going to mention is TISA, and that stands for Trade Investment Services Agreement. And that's important because the U.S. has a comparative advantage in services, as my colleagues on this panel will attest to. Not only financial services, but in services across the board. We run a huge surplus with other countries. And so we're working together with 23 other economies, including the EU. That's cheating a little because it counts as one economy, but it's actually 28 member states. So with a significant number of countries, we are negotiating in Geneva ways to lower barriers to services. So those are the four main T's: TPA, TPP, TTIP, and TISA. And I won't ask anyone to say them quickly unless you're really, unless we have a few drinks first.
Thank you very much. We will come back to some of the T's, maybe all of them, in a few minutes. Let me start with way on the far right, Jim, and ask you to just make some general comments about your views of the importance of trade, the impact it's had on your business career, and so forth.
Well, Pat, thank you very much. Steve, thank you very much, and CED for this opportunity to talk about a vital subject. And Miriam, thank you very much for getting all those T's out ahead of us. So just to begin, I'll make it clear, I do support the President in his effort to get TPA, TPP, TTIP, and TISA all through the Senate and House. If he does, it will be a magnificent bipartisan agreement, and an example that, contrary to the video, we actually can do something in Washington, and contrary to many people's views of the President, you will know that you have a very pro-business President and President Obama. I was on a similar type of panel at Harvard Business School recently with Larry Summers, and he said that it was very, very difficult, almost impossible to be both expert on a subject and objective about a subject. Because if you were expert, you had studied it, you had worked in it, and therefore it was almost impossible to be objective. Now, of course, this was a panel on financial markets, and he was suggesting that the one person in the world who was both expert and objective about financial markets was Larry Summers. However, what I want to say today is I am very much in the objective camp about trade. But I did take economics in college, and so anybody who has taken economics and paid attention, to the macro class will know that trade creates wealth in total. So if you want more wealth, you should be for more trade. But that is wealth in total, and how it is shared out, depends. Now, if you have a worker who makes, say, $80,000, and a worker who makes $10,000, and through trade, the 10,000 guy can make 20, and the 80,000 person goes down to 40, then one worker has made a lot more, and that's good, but another worker has made less. Now, two other parties benefit. The consumer in the country gets goods made for either 20 or 40, and you don't have to do the shipping. So the consumers do well, and the capitalists who take advantage of the arbitrage do well. But to be absolutely sure, if you're the $80,000 worker who now is making 40, you have not done well by trade. Now, I note that the President has said that in these agreements, he's going to work to have equal labor standards and similar environmental standards and so forth. I hope that's true, and to the degree it's possible. I, however, am skeptical that within the agreement themselves, you'll be able to achieve all of the goals which have been touted. And I think, in effect, what we're going to see, what we have seen is, contrary to the session yesterday saying there's growing inequality in the United States, in the world, inequality has been lessening tremendously on a global basis. Those guys who are making 10, they now make 20. The guys who are making 80 make 40. They are more equal than they were before, and that's a good thing on a global basis. And frankly, I see it as inevitable, which brings us to the other topic of yesterday, which I think is absolutely vital. If you want to sign up for free trade, if you want to take advantage of it as capitalists, what you have to do as Americans is similarly commit to education. Because without education, you're going to leave, frankly, the 55-year-old worker who is being replaced, those wages will never come back. But what you want is for the children of those people to be able to get the education, as was discussed in the panel yesterday, which will enable them to be competitive in the new global world. Thank you very much, Pat.
Thank you, Jim. Bob?
Thanks, Jim. I actually agree with some of that, and particularly the potential that if this TPA bill gets done and therefore TPP gets done, that's just huge. And what's curious about it to me, in part, as sort of a layman in this space, is you've got Vietnam in an agreement with Japan and Australia. You've got South American countries of much less scale and sophistication, but the total of 40% of global GDP is amazing, and it really, I think, would have tremendous benefit. So here's what I see. Now, I'm an accountant and auditor, so I like precision, like earnings per share, things you can actually calculate. And whenever we're talking about trade or economics, it just isn't precise at all. In fact, as we look at our clients here in the U.S., I'll say U.S.-based multinationals, we're dealing with a relatively strong dollar. Now, people would say, well, if your currency is strong, that's wonderful. Why wouldn't you want that to be the case all the time? Well, of course, if our currency is strong, our goods are less desirable to those outside the United States. At the same time, we can purchase and import at more favorable prices. The best thing I've been able to figure out is, with that dynamic, you probably could save $50 on a hotel room in Paris, but I'm not sure, because travel and services and those kinds of things all go into this. My point is that everything is sort of relative, and what you have to look at is the trend. In the case of the strong dollar, I mean, our prospects are bright compared to the rest of the world. I'm setting China aside in terms of GDP growth, but there are consequences to everything. And so for our clients who either export, one of my clients is Boeing. Well, it's true that a lot of parts are in-sourced to the United States, but final assembly is done here. And if you buy a Dreamliner, you got to go pick it up in South Carolina or in Everett, Washington. They have to be one of the largest exporters in the United States. Contrast that with General Motors or Dow Chemical, where a lot of their manufacturing is in the local market. And so when you have a strong dollar, the thing that hurts profits is the fact that in part it's currency, because half of your revenues are coming from outside the United States, and these are dollar functional currency companies, so everything has to be translated into dollars, and you end up with losses coming from overseas, or reduced profits. So even though those dynamics affect reported earnings and multiples and all that kind of thing, we still are sitting in a very, very good place as a country. Our business is services. Now, services, I think Miriam mentioned it, in terms of balance of trade, we've been positive on services for a long time, led largely by royalties and those kinds of things. But whether it's IT or the kinds of things we do where our people are billed by the hour, we have, it's very difficult with our global platform. We're 15 billion in the U.S., approaching 40 billion globally, to move your resources around with freedom. So H-1B visas become a very big deal for us, getting the experts you need in the markets you need them, sometimes for extended periods of time. It's not about a trade agreement, but other policies and other constraints, get in the way of success, and I think it's just part of what we have to deal with. But I do think our clients, our firm, and most people with common sense are very much for getting these agreements done. And I think even though a worker may be displaced, you really have to look at the other argument that's the broader impact on the economy, including maybe that worker being retrained and having another position.
Hollis.
Well, thank you to CED. Thank you, Pat. I'm flattered to be on the panel here. I appreciate being included. I would put a proviso that my kids don't think I'm qualified to do anything. And I have to mention that my lawyers told me that I should tell you that anything I say that you think is brilliant, clever, is a city view, and anything that makes you roll your eyes is mine. Citi, as you may know if you watched the TV, has been in business for 200 years. And at the center of our activity across 101 countries where we have people on the ground, another 70 is trade. Trade has been critical from the beginning. So the Panama Canal was a major activity in which we were involved, the Transcontinental Railroad, and even the Space Shuttle. Trade has been at the heart of helping us support American industry and American labor. And it's clear to us that it is absolutely fundamental that we, in fact, continue to support the trade, but we need to have the tools and the instruments in place. We need to have these agreements in place. I can't go into the statistics because I see so many different ones on jobs won, jobs lost, but I can say that one of the things that is a determinant for the success of companies is to have clarity of rules of engagement, to understand how they're going to be treated. And one of the things that we see embedded in the treaties is creating additional clarity, and more transparency. We recognize that nothing is going to be perfect and that it's never going to be a 100% win, but it's something that we feel is just fundamentally important. On the same side is something like the Ex-Im Bank. We today, because of our 101 countries, we deal with 50 countries that in fact have institutions that support trade and in many instances have rules that are significantly less onerous than the Ex-Ims. For example, the percentage of content, the necessity to use flagships, things of that nature. Of the 68 different organizations that represent trade in the 50 countries, their principal objective is to support the trade of their country. And it's one of the things that as a tool, I worry when I hear us discussing unilaterally disarming, being the only country that doesn't have this tool available. Last year for us, we looked at 3,300, I believe, applications from support for SMEs, roughly 80%, over 80% of what the Ex-Im did were from the small companies. And that's critical to Citi and our franchise as we look at it. The other is we look at the United States deciding not to participate in certain international activities. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, China is responding, from my perspective, in a post-Bretton Woods world. They have looked at the fact that they have moved into an economic power that they weren't when the IMF and the IRBD, World Bank, was created in 1945. They are now saying, we're not at the table. We're not even at the second row of tables. And because we haven't included them, they are taking action. We have chosen to sit on the sideline. There are only two major significant countries today that aren't playing, Japan and the United States. 57 other countries, hope I have that number right, have decided to participate. It's very hard to be influential when you're on the side. We might have been able in the 1950s and the 1960s to be able to, in fact, have such a strong, powerful position that we could have muscled the AIIB membership in a different manner. But the world has changed. We need to be a participant, just as we need to be a part of these agreements. I'm going to go one year before you and quote Cordell Hull. Cordell Hull, I'm paraphrasing, fundamentally said that free trade was critical to the success of the world and to continue to have global peace and global prosperity. And that was 1944, I believe, but it's just absolutely critical from our perspective that we continue to be a participant.
Let me, as you can see, this panel has individuals, all of whom are strong in support of expanding trade agreements, etc. So the question then is that I would pose for the panel members, why is it such a challenge to get political consensus in favor of trade? Why is it such an obstacle to moving forward in this regard, given the views of those on the panel? There's obviously those have different views. So let me open it up. Miriam.
Well, I think that's a really important question to ask here because there is a huge debate going on right now in this country. It's a bit ironic because if you ask people, raise your hand if you're in favor of global commerce, most people will raise their hand. if you say, what about trade? People might think, well, wait a minute, I've heard some negative things. Let me think about that. Ultimately, most people, Democrat or Republican, based on extensive polling done by Pew and others, will raise their hand and go, yeah, we support trade. We support the T's we laid out, TPP, TTIP. But a lot of it gets lost in the debate, and I think there are a couple of reasons why. First of all, as my colleagues said earlier, trade can lead to job dislocation and job loss. Because when you lower the barriers, whether they're tariff barriers, like duties on imported goods, or they're non-tariff barriers, which can be up to licensing requirements or regulatory red tape that it's harder to see, but nonetheless there. When you reduce those, you have more goods flowing back and forth. You have more exports from the U.S., you have more imports from the other country. Now, imports are not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of imports go into products that the U.S. then exports, so they end up counting as exports, and they're essential for those exports. They also lower the cost of goods for consumers. So nonetheless, sometimes imports are seen as a bad thing. But when you have growing trade, then less competitive sectors and industries will be facing the brunt of that. Overall, there is net job gain, but nonetheless, there is some loss. And to that individual or that family that has job loss, it's devastating and gets a lot more attention than often the jobs that are created. So what does the U.S. do about this? Because it's a problem that we should be able to address. Job retraining is critical. You'll hear another T, Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA, which is moving in parallel with TPA, because a number of members of Congress, mostly Democrats, and the White House too, feel very strongly that if we're going to move the trade bill, we also have to move more assistance for workers who need to be retrained. Also, I think, as Ed Rust in the panel yesterday spoke so eloquently about, we have a skills gap in this country, irrespective of trade. We also have an education gap. So we need to be able to start closing those gaps so that all of our workers, at whatever stage of life, can compete more effectively. Another reason why I think there's so much controversy is trade agreements today are huge and cover so many different areas. For example, you mentioned labor and environment. That wasn't always part of a trade agreement. It started with NAFTA, but in a very loose sense. Well, every trade agreement since NAFTA has built upon the previous one to have higher standards, and now the labor and environmental provisions are extremely high, and I believe in TPP they'll be even higher, and they're legally enforceable. So the U.S. can take action against another country that does not uphold those obligations on the same basis that it could as if that country was denying U.S. companies market access. So that's a very important change. But because these agreements are so broad, digital economy, tariffs I mentioned, non-tariff barriers, labor, environment, intellectual property rights protections, and many other issues, that there are so many different groups, stakeholders, who have different interests. And so when you bring this all together, you obviously have some opposition. And what's important now is that we have discussions like this that are open, and we try to separate the myths from what's really fact. Because to have that discussion, it really needs to be based on a common understanding of what's going on.
Thank you, Bob.
Just picking up on that, that's a lot more articulate than I'm about to be, but I think of this as I call it the public health view. Okay, if you're responsible for public health in the United States and there's a medical condition, a disease or something that affects a very small fraction of 1%, you may have policy initiatives that it's not worth spending a lot on R&D or this or that. That's fine unless your family is affected as one of those very small percentages. So think about running a company where you decide for economic reasons you have to close a plant, you have to shut down a product line, maybe you stop selling something. There's almost always, you don't want your workers just completely displaced. You find ways to either retrain, severance in order to sort of ease that. And I think trade has the same impact. It's easy to tell the story about an individual or this family and what happened to one person, but more broadly, when you look at it, there are a lot of benefits to the United States as a whole and the economy as well. So I know in the negotiation, or at least as reported, things like subsidies for health insurance for 4 years for displaced workers. I think Ron Wyden was one of the principals there, was introducing, and everybody's sort of got their little piece of this, but it's hard, to your question, Pat, because it is political, and there are groups that favor, and there are groups that don't, and they're very vocal and well-funded, and so it creates just a lot of noise, which is not good to getting something done. I think that's just part of the reality.
Jim, any comments on?
I think Miriam gave a pretty comprehensive view. I'll just sort of sharpen it up a little bit. You have my classmate Sherrod Brown, senator from Ohio, and his judgment of the net of all this for Ohio, for the workers in Ohio who elect him. He thinks they're going to be worse off. And he may be right, may be wrong, but that's his judgment. And, that's called democracy. He represents those people of Ohio, and he's come to that conclusion. I would say that there's another element of it, which is that when you open up free trade, immediately you begin to get the benefits of the free trading, but it's down the road that the plants get closed, it's down the road that people get laid off, and it's down the road that they can get retrained. Maybe they can get a job at an equal pay, probably not. History suggests not. And so there's, I'm delighted by the variety of things which the President has baked into the agreements, and I'm hopeful that will ease it up. But my own view, as I said in my last remark, is that we all have to be committed to education, because I think that is what the people broadly will need in order to have our fellow Americans be competitive in a global world where it's Mexicans you're competing against, it's Chinese you're competing against, Vietnamese.
Hollis? Well, the education theme absolutely echoes across as one of the things that we have to do as an investment to be responsive. And again, it is the fact that the people who are the most vulnerable, the folks who have the skills today that are less competitive, are the ones who do get impacted. I think at least the literature I've looked at does indicate that for the higher skilled individuals, they tend to benefit. I think the export companies today pay 18% more on average. I think that's a Chamber of Commerce statistic than those that don't export. But there is a vulnerability, and it's something, again, as a country that we need to be thinking about at the same time and investing. I would change the topic just a moment, though. Bob talked about the H-1Bs. This year, there were, I think as of today, about 240,000 applications. The 67,000 available slots were filled, I think, in 7 days. 1 out of 4 of the new companies formed in the last 5-6 years had somebody who was born in a foreign country. Today, we're driving out of the United States people that we have invested a great deal of money and time and effort in terms of the education, and we're sending them out of the country, frankly, to compete with the United States. So I am very empathetic, and I think there's a genuine concern that we've got to take care and make an effort for those people who are being displaced, because it's real, it's tangible, and they really need the help. But on the other hand, we have to think about the fact that we need to continue to drive the U.S. economy, and talent and intellectual capital is a fundamental part of it.
Please, Miriam.
I just want to add an additional point that I think ties together what each of us said, and that is that it's very easy to tie trade to the problems that we've just outlined in terms of growing income inequality in this country, stagnant wages, and the serious education and skills gap that we have. But those are not problems caused by trade. Studies have shown about 4 million jobs are lost each year, not net, but lost because of globalization, because whether or not we have a trade agreement, we trade with other countries. We have to. 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States. And with the countries with which we do have a trade agreement, there are 20 total, it's not a very high number, we run a surplus, even in manufactured goods. But when you look at the discussions about trade, they always focus on the deficit. Those are with countries with whom we do not have a trade agreement. And part of the reason is we have a relatively open economy. We have extremely low tariffs on most products, and we have a very liberalized services market, as my colleagues, the success of their companies attest to. Other economies are not like that. And so without a trade agreement, our companies and our workers at a real disadvantage, because they cannot easily access those markets which have much higher tariff and non-tariff barriers.
One of the trade falls into many of the categories of policy areas that CED looks at, in the sense of trying to focus on public policy that will enhance the long-term economic competitiveness of the United States. And the offset of that is our political system, which is incredibly focused on short-term results. You get elected by demonstrating to the voters short-term benefits. So one of the strong recommendations in all of the CED reports on trade is the important role of business leaders in communicating with the elected officials and with the public about the long-term benefits of trade, and how trade, enhancement of trade, will in fact create more jobs, higher paying jobs and so forth in total, even though to get there, there's likely to be economic disruption, and some people, and using Jim's case, whose wages will go down. So any comments from the panel on things that you believe that business leaders ought to be doing to a greater extent than is now being done? One of the criticisms that appeared in one of the recent papers I read was that CEOs of companies aren't actively engaging with the political leaders on the importance of this. So I'm curious as to whether panel members have comments on this. Anybody want to jump in?
Well, I'll take one quick comment on this. Particularly, Hollis, you brought up twice the need to expand the H-1B visa program, and I just wonder if at the same time you're prepared to tackle the total immigration problem that we have in the United States, because as I understand it, this is something which could be easily resolved within a total immigration package, but absent that, it will be very difficult. Now, are business leaders prepared to say, we actually are for total immigration reform?
Miriam?
Well, so here's a really important acronym that does not start with a T, and that's SME, small and medium enterprises. They are the backbone of our economy, as with most economies around the world, and they actually represent a relatively small percent of exporters. But overall, when you look at every single U.S. company exporting, because there's so many more SMEs than any other, than large companies, they're actually a significant percent of our exporters. And they're the ones, most of all, that need help. Just as Hollis spoke about business certainty for large companies, it's also critical and even more important for the SMEs, because they simply don't have the resources to fight regulatory red tape overseas, or to try and fight discrimination against investments that they may make without a trade agreement and knowing that the U.S. government is behind them. So I think talking more about the SMEs and how they will benefit from Trade Promotion Authority and from these trade agreements is something that is really important to do more of. I know it's starting, but it's really important to do even more of that. So I think there's things that we can do that we're not doing. And there's also one other very important one to tie it back to politics, which of course is what we have to do because we're in Washington, and this is an exciting period of time on the Hill. But I see Democrats on the Hill as being in a fairly tough place. There are less than a dozen members of the House that have come out, Democrats in the House, that have come out in favor of TPA. And I think what they're up against is unions and other groups have frozen funding while the TPA debate is going on and made it clear that they're looking to see how folks vote. But on the other side, business organizations tend to be more likely, at least in the past, to support Republican candidates over Democratic candidates. So what's a Democrat to do? And I think that kind of uncertainty is not going to help this debate move to a better place. And so I think that the business community has an opportunity to, for example, say, we're going to be looking more at votes than party affiliation if SMEs and larger companies believe that this is important and that this matters and that they want to see the TPA bill move forward.
Miriam, it sounds like what you're suggesting is that business get involved and communicate the importance of these policies to their elected representatives.
I think that's critical.
So Pat, on that point, though, I mean, I think what's changed, and I think this is true for business leaders generally, the visibility to the general public of taking a point of view, showing some leadership, or as Steve Odland would say, statesmanship, has never been the same since, let's say, the late 90s. As we had some of the crises in the early 2000s, everybody kind of went underground. But I do know, whether it's the BRT, the Chamber, other groups, including CED from time to time, there is engagement on the Hill. It's just not a very visible engagement. So we end up, like many organizations, we have our CEO changes every 4 years or so. And my advice always is, you really need to establish credibility on the Hill with people that matter, whether it's committee chairs or your own elected representatives, and you need to do it by expressing an interest in whatever the agenda is. At some point, maybe down the road, there may be something that's extremely important. I'll use our example to Deloitte, but that can't be the first time you meet somebody. You need to be doing this, several times a year with some cadence, and I think a lot of people do that, but I don't think it's highly visible either in our case to my partners necessarily or to the public at large. I think people that really understand how to get things done are engaged. I do sort of hearken fondly back to the days of real statesmanship when CEO lunch speeches would attract big crowds and there'd be something in the newspaper. That seems to be long gone. I think more people follow Kanye West on Twitter than they do a CEO of pick your favorite multinational, and that's where we are. But I do think there is engagement, and some of the groups that facilitate that are very good, but I still think company by company you should be looking after your constituents, your shareholders, your employees, and so forth.
Thank you. Hollis, anything on that?
No.
Let me before we open up to the audience, let me raise one question that is a big one relative to international trade, which is, what is the view of panel members of the slowdown in economic growth in China likely to, how is that likely to affect trade going forward? China, the growth of the Chinese economy over the last 20 years has been a huge contributor to international trade, both in the United States and many other countries, and with the slowdown of the Chinese economy, what do you think are the prospects that that's going to leave us with?
All right. I will try that one. I'll wade in. I think it's going to be very significant. I sat in on a conference earlier this year in which a number of Chinese economists and people from the Chinese government were taking tremendous umbrage at Larry Summers, and he had suggested that China's growth would be 2%, 3% range. They were saying it'll be 7 to 8%, then 7, then 6.5. The impact, China has been such a significant player in the global markets, 50% of fish meal, 50% of iron ore, numbers that are truly staggering, and that was as a purchaser. They had the capacity in some industries to actually go from being an importer to an exporter. And while we can look at the amount of debt they have today as well as the $4 trillion of reserves, it's the fact that they are such an important, they've been the major engine for global growth. If indeed their growth is slowing to the point of going below 7, 6, 5, or 4, they may have impact there, but it is going to affect Southeast Asia, it's going to affect Latin America, and it'll affect the United States as well. So right now, they are slowing, and visibly slowing, and it is going to have significant consequences for the next couple of years.
Jim?
I think it should be no surprise that China's economy is slowing. The notion that an economy the size that they are today could continue to grow at a 10% plus level just beggars the imagination. I recall back in the 80s, Southeast Asia was growing at very, very high rates, and people were talking at that time that there was something about the Asian culture which was much more conducive to growth, and we in America needed to adopt these Asian values if we wanted to grow the way they did. And another one of my classmates, Paul Krugman, wrote, no, there's nothing special about the Asian culture. They're simply utilizing more workforce than it had before. And once you have fully utilized the workforce, it's going to stop growing at that level. And of course, he was exactly right. That's what happened. So I don't think you should be surprised at what's happening to China, and we should simply, be, looking at a global macro level that it will be 7 or 6 this year, and 5, and maybe they can hold that for a while, and maybe they can bump it up a little bit, but it's never going to go back to double digit.
I don't have any wisdom on China per se. You guys have already made the points, but just so no one's confused, China is not part of this deal. Russia is not part of this deal. And although I did see something in some of the coverage suggesting that, well, if China found the terms acceptable, they could jump in. I'm guessing that's probably not expected. Just thought I'd ask you that, Miriam.
Well, you're right in the sense that the TPP is open to all members of APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. That can demonstrate they meet the high standards of the agreement. So China is a member of APEC, Russia is a member of APEC. They could raise their hand and say we want to join, and Russia has not been interested even prior to the tensions over Ukraine and the seizure of Crimea. But China sort of has indicated sometimes it's interested, sometimes it's pulled back. I think it is watching TPP very closely, and I don't exclude the possibility that one day it might affirmatively decide it does want to join, but it's not a simple matter of just joining. I mean, this is going to be a very high standard agreement, and China's going to have to demonstrate that it's there already, not that it's going to come in and take time to get there. So it's correct what you're hearing, but it's not an issue we need to grapple with right now, in my view. I also want to say on the question that Pat posed, I think the optimistic scenario would be that China could use the slowdown, which still, the growth rate still exceeds just about every country except I think it's India right now, but they could still use that as the engine for more liberalization and market reforms so that they could truly change their economy. That's the optimistic scenario. I think the pessimistic one, which is probably more likely in the near term, is that we'll see even more state control and more subsidies and more efforts to try to prop up the growth rate and create more employment, which of course is a huge problem for China. Let me just close that part by saying, by the way, the Chinese government does not need to wait for TPA to do a trade agreement, and it's done many over the last few years with Australia, with other partners, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. It's offered to do one with Europe. And again, if we don't step up, Congress doesn't step up, then we risk ceding to countries like China the ability to set much lower standards for global trade.
One thing I'd just add, in fact, is the strategy that at least I'm seeing that China is using, which is in fact one tool to bolster their economy, is to be heavily involved in the global infrastructure activity even outside of Asia. Now, Asia has purportedly $8 trillion need for infrastructure, water, port, energy, transportation, but this is a similar need around the world. And one of the surprises to me is I was in Africa last year and visiting a number of countries, and I know there are anecdotal exceptions, but going through a half dozen countries, I entered the countries thinking I would hear that China was extractive and exploitive. I talked to academics, government officials, and corporations, and they saw them quite differently. They described them as being much more strategic and much longer-term partnership, and it made me revisit some of the thinking I brought to that, and to look at how they are using as part of bolstering their global economy, their economy, the global need for infrastructure, and how much the government has that as a strategy to keep their industry going. And I think we need to be much more sensitive to it. One of the reasons why I was concerned that we chose to stay out of AIIB.
Thank you. Let me, we have a few more minutes to open it up to the audience, and if somebody could give me, it's very hard to see hands because of the lights. So are there any questions in the audience? We would certainly welcome them. And I cannot see.
There's one here. Larry Buxman, I'm with EY, and the panel did a great job on tying education to resources to trade. There's something that I'm sensing may be happening, and I think it is important also in the context of the large countries. It's important to business leadership, and I wonder if any of you have thought about it or are aware of some thinking given to it. But the trend of the last decade is that many companies use labor arbitrage. They're moving labor elsewhere. So there is a prudent choice made by corporate executives to move labor to countries where labor is most efficient. Then the education really occurs on those countries. This is skill-based education. The skill-based education is being done by corporate funds, managed and provided from developing countries, predominantly the US. I wonder if it has ever been measured. The objective of this is actually providing skills-based and highly intense education, value-added education, potentially on behalf of other countries and other governments. This is being done, paid by potentially US shareholders, some government's incentives, and others, and indirectly benefiting many countries and indirectly potentially undermining certain larger initiatives. So my sense, there has been a large chunk of unmeasured education export by the US that's being done that way. Again, not for the wrong reasons. This is totally corporate optimization. But the pervasive outcome is many of the things that we do. So yes, B112 can do something. Yes, high schools and education here can do something. But to me, there could be a large amount there that potentially contributing to what we are seeing today, and I would be interested in your comments.
I appreciate your comment and observation, which I think is correct, but I'm not 100% sure on the specific question you're posing for the panel.
The question is, first to the panel is, has it been observed and measured to your knowledge? Is there any government objective to do something about it, either consciously or by promoting certain elements of agenda? And thirdly, is it real?
Let me just, because I too, just like EY, in a people business, people intensive, and certainly the extent that we have some people in India, I'll use the example, who are actually working solely for the U.S. firm. And so what you measure is the cost of that labor, which is much less than the U.S., and then you have to add back to that in your equation, though, what skills-based training do you have to provide so that they meet your standards in the U.S., whether it's for clients or for our regulators who are watching very carefully as to supervision and the like. So I don't know how I would even measure that, but it's clear there's some investment in that country, including training dollars. But I don't know that I've never thought of it that way, and I can't imagine we have a mechanism as a country to measure any of that. But
Hollis, were you about to say something?
No.
Jim?
Well, I'll just give an example of the point you're making. Rolls-Royce put up a new jet engine factory in Singapore, and I'm not sure, the totality of what drove them to do it. My guess is it's not so much wages, because I don't think the wages in Singapore are that much lower than wages in the UK. It's probably the taxation that they had. Probably there was special investment by the Singaporean government. But there's a fine British company, Rolls-Royce, who is training a workforce in Singapore to build jet engines, and as they get new orders, the orders are not coming into Britain, they're coming into Singapore.
If I was running that multinational company, I would certainly want to count that as part of my investment in the economy and make sure that the local government officials understood that that was part of what I was doing. With education, it's interesting because if a foreign student studies in the United States, that tuition, which is, any of you are parents also out there know, extremely high, depending on where you go, that counts as a U.S. export. If a foreigner gets their hair cut at a barbershop, that counts as a U.S. export. So we do have a significant component of educational services, and if we supply providers overseas, that also counts as a U.S. service export. But your question is a very interesting one, and I would urge companies to think about counting that as investment.
I'm under strict instructions from Steve Volland, end on time, and now the clock tells me I'm 49 seconds over. So please thank the panel for this very active engagement, and thank you.